Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. So you'll see from our publication that this year we decided to present our roundup of Adtech news by way of a numerical snapshot of what's been going on. I'm still on Stanley Tucci. But what I thought I would do with this time is just to pick out 4 themes which I think emerge from some of those developments over the last year or so. So the first theme is just to highlight what I think is the real effectiveness of pressure groups and data activists at driving the regulatory agenda when it comes to Adtech. We've seen privacy pressure groups for some time express concerns about online behavioral advertising. And what we're increasingly seeing and continuing to see is them really shaping the enforcement agenda. Now, in some respects, that's not particularly surprising. Regulators exist to handle complaints. So a complaint comes in from a privacy group and they will look at it. But I do think in the Adtech space, it's noticeable how much success they've had in getting real enforcement action from their initial report to a complaint, to a regulator making an investigation to the enforcement. And groups like Privacy International, the Open Rights Group, the Norwegian Consumer Council have all been very active in this space and have all had some real successes. This year, our friend again, Max, NOYB, Max Schrems' group, have also been busy. For a couple of years now, they've been sending out complaints to companies in relation to their practices for cookie banners. And the typical approach is they send out a draft complaint and they say, you've got a few weeks to sort it out. And if you don't, we're going to complain to a data protection authority. They issued over 500 complaints back in 2021, and that's continued this year. There have been almost 230 more complaints to 18 data protection authorities in relation to some quite specific concerns about cookie banners, probably the most notable of which is whether you're using a reject all button at the first level of a cookie banner. And so we're starting to see a bit more take-up of that, largely because of NOYB. So we're seeing them not just being effective in terms of getting regulators to take action, but they're actually getting industry to change. They're getting providers like OneTrust to change their settings that are made available to organizations. So that was the first theme. The second theme is obviously related, which is just to say that regulators are continuing to be engaged in the Adtech world, continuing to be prepared to issue significant enforcement action. So we've seen big fines this year from the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, against Criteo, and that's an example of one that started with Privacy International back in 2018. We've obviously just heard about some very significant fines for Meta, which obviously relate to contractual necessity, but I think it's quite noticeable when you look down the list of the biggest GDPR fines, how many of them have personalized advertising issues as their subject matter. We're also seeing an uptick in non-European related Adtech enforcement. So we've seen the first CCPA fine this year against Sephora. That was a $1.2 million settlement, but it all related to the use of tracking technologies on websites. We've seen an increasingly proactive FTC in America take action against groups like BetterHelp for sharing health data with advertisers. And obviously in the US, we're seeing a whole range of new US state laws pop up. We may get a federal privacy law at some point. So all that is to say, Adtech enforcement is not just a European issue anymore. However, the industry is responding. I spoke last year at this exact session about the decision of the Belgian Data Protection Authority against IAB Europe, which concerned the transparency and consent framework, which, just as a reminder, that's the protocol by which and the framework within which user consents are shared and disseminated across the ecosystem. That decision has been appealed, and the appeal court has referred some questions to the CJEU. That's probably a topic for another day. But in the meantime, IAB Europe have not been idle, and they've come up with an action plan to address some of the concerns raised by the Belgian Data Protection Authority. And that culminated last week in the launch of TCF 2.2, which is the latest iteration. And that's made some specific changes to try and address some of those concerns. So in particular, you'll no longer be able to rely on legitimate interests for certain processing purposes, in particular the targeted advertising purposes. Requirement for greater transparency for users around things like the number of vendors being used and retention periods. and probably most crucially, regular resurfacing of consent options. So users aren't just consenting once and then it goes away. They have the ability to give and withdraw consent over time. So that's one way the industry has responded. Probably the main way the industry has been grappling with privacy challenges is through technology change. And the end of third-party cookies is probably the biggest driver of change in the industry, and that remains the case. And third-party cookies have already ended on some browsers. Chrome, which is obviously the biggest one, is going to end support for third-party cookies sometime in 2024. And what you're seeing is a range of new technologies and new approaches pop up. And the point I wanted to make here, and the point to leave you with, is those new technologies, which there's quite a variety of them, raise some potentially interesting data protection questions. So what we're seeing is a trend away from sort of hyper-targeted user-level targeting towards more use of predictive modeling, more sophisticated contextual advertising, more use of cohorts and groups to drive advertising rather than user level. And I think some of the issues that gives rise to are issues like identifiability. So we might have to grapple again with these issues we see in regulatory guidance like singling out, the motivated intruder test, re-identification risk. All of these issues we're going to have to grapple with in the context of these new technologies. And there's not settled case law and there's not settled guidance, so they're potentially complex. We've always got to have an eye on e-privacy requirements. So as we look at all these new technologies, do any of them trigger e-privacy rules? Obviously cookies did, but what about other forms of identifier, and particularly in the mobile space? And as we're into greater use of probabilistic models, do we have to start thinking about the intersection between inference data and special category data? So if you're making an assumption about someone, is that special category data if it relates to special category related issues? And finally, we're likely to see very sophisticated forms of contextual advertising pop up. So you're not using user data anymore, but you are still receiving adverts that are, in some respects, targeted at you. They're based on what they think you're going to be interested in. And as that starts to develop, we might start to see that fail what we call the creepy test. So you're still feeling like you're being followed around the internet, even though your data is not being used. So we have to be quite certain about what falls on the right side of the line between behavioral and contextual advertising. So all of that is to say there's a lot going on and there's a lot of interesting issues, and we're all going to be very busy for the next few years, hopefully. And with that, I'll pass over to Faye, who's going to talk about children's data.